Hello, this is Brad Carmack, the author of Homosexuality, A Straight BYU Student's Perspective. You're welcome to download my book for free from bradcarmack.blogspot.com. You can also go there to watch the rest of my book as YouTube videos. If you'd like a hard copy, you can request one at homosexualityperspective@yahoo.com. In this clip, we're going to be taking a look at more rebuttals to common anti-same-sex marriage arguments. In part 1, we looked at parenting and children consequences. In this part, we're going to look at religious consequences. I'm going to address 3 common arguments against same-sex marriage that are based on religious consequences. The first is that same-sex marriage threatens my family's religious values. The second argument is that churches, including the LDS Church, will have to perform same-sex marriage. And the third argument is that religious liberty is threatened by legalizing same-sex marriage. So the first argument is about a threat to one's own religious values and their family. The argument's kind of basically, sure, maybe letting same-sex couples marry doesn't directly affect my marriage, but it does contribute to a culture and environment that is hostile and non-supportive of the religious values that I espouse. This might look like influences in society and at school where children are subjected to ideas and norms that same-sex couple marriages are approvable. The problem with this argument is twofold. The first is that it's sort of a one-sided argument, in that there are plenty of families that are on the other side of the battle that would disagree, that would say, well, I have a religious value and or a moral value that it is the right thing to do for same-sex couples to have marriage, and that it's wrong to preclude them. And so those families are damaged on the other side by prohibiting same-sex marriage. So the argument really doesn't get very far unless you can establish that one set of values is superior to another and should be given preference. There's a quote here kind of illustrating this tension. It says, "If there are 12 million gay Americans, that would be more than the population of any but the 7 largest states, and is not a trivial number. Even if the number were much smaller, each gay person is an individual seeking the good life. Not one of those lives is inconsequential, and to assume that we, meaning the heterosexual majority, should deny millions of Americans any chance to marry if allowing them to marry would cause us any harm or inconvenience at all is to account gay welfare as essentially worthless. A one-eyed utilitarian is a blind utilitarian." So I do acknowledge that there are consequences, and that same-sex marriage may represent a threat to a particular family or person's religious values, but it doesn't suffice as an argument against same-sex marriage because that same argument could be used in the opposite direction. To conclude this section, there's a quote that says, "Conversely, the fact that a moral value is derived from a religious belief should not shield that moral value from contestation in the public domain." So we may be willing to give deference to religious freedom, but if a religious belief is used as an argument in the public domain, it needs to be subject to scrutiny just like any other argument would, else we'd be privileging religious beliefs in enshrining law. Okay, so let's rebuttal to the first argument about same-sex marriage threatening my family's religious values. The second of the 3 that we're going to talk about is that churches will have to perform same-sex marriage. I've heard this a lot. I'd imagine many of this audience has as well. The fear is, of course, that, say in the LDS Church, that bishops or temple sealers will be forced to marry same-sex couples against their will if same-sex marriage is made legal in the United States. My question is, on what law or grounds would such a suit proceed? Of course, the church can be sued over anything, right? There's a pretty low bar for filing an action against an entity. The question is whether or not that action would have a basis for success. And I fail to think of a candidate basis for success. Let's say a same-sex couple sued the LDS Church for not the bishop's failure to marry them. I'm wondering what basis in law would they have an entitlement or a right to that privilege they were denied. Another question would be, why isn't the church experiencing this trouble in Canada, where same-sex marriage is legalized? How come the bishops there aren't forced to marry same-sex couples? Why don't we see the same problem in Massachusetts, Connecticut, Iowa, New Hampshire, or Vermont, where same-sex marriage is already legal? I think the answer there is that private religious practice is given high deference in the United States, and indeed in federal courts and state courts. Religions are not government actors, and usually they are not subject to the high constitutional standards that, say, a civil official or justice of the peace would be subject to in performing marriages. Additionally, if it did become a problem, the church could do the same simple workaround that it has in other countries where the legal landscape is different and arguably more adversarial to the church's position on marriage, namely, make the couple go to the justice of the peace first, have them go get married civilly first, and then they can come and get married by the bishop or married by the sealer in the temple. In that case, the state cares what the church does just about as much as they care whether or not they baptize people, which is to say they don't care at all. So it's a pretty easy workaround. Now, the more proximal hazards are not so much that a bishop would be forced to perform a same-sex marriage, but that perhaps the church would lose some of their property tax exemptions or maybe their income tax exemption. These threats have been brought up as well, and they also are thin in their foundation. There's a quote here that says, and this is about the tax exemption loss, the risk of losing tax exempt status. He says, almost certainly not. The major case under federal tax law is Bob Jones versus United States. There they had a charitable organization that had to serve a public purpose and not very contrary to established public policy. They had to be in harmony with public interests, and the institution's purpose must not be so at odds with community conscience as to undermine public benefit. It's very unlikely for the court to do that. It's unlikely for the IRS to even bring that action to begin with. The IRS is a relatively conservative federal agency. It's extremely unlikely that the IRS would try to bring some sort of action to take away the church's tax-exempt status based on their views on same-sex marriage. Again, speaking on the risk of losing tax-exempt status on the basis of not performing same-sex marriage, one commentator wrote, "This argument truly stretches the bounds of existing legal doctrine. No religious organization other than Bob Jones University has ever had its tax-exempt status revoked because of discriminatory rules that it applied on the basis of race or any other category." Additionally, the church is not a university, as Bob Jones was, and religions typically get more deference than universities do. Last, if there is danger to the church, it's more likely to come on other more obvious grounds, such as their gender inequality treatment, which is more threatening than orientation discrimination in most jurisprudence and jurisdictions. And also, the church's questionable and non-transparent political lobbying, for instance, in the Equal Rights Amendment and during Proposition 8, more likely jeopardizes their status and their views or practices regarding same-sex marriage. So if the church is going to lose some privileges or freedoms, those are a lot more likely than losing them based on refusal to marry a same-sex couple. In regards to this issue, the Connecticut Supreme Court said, "Finally, religious autonomy is not threatened by recognizing the right of same-sex couples to marry civilly. Religious freedom will not be jeopardized by the marriage of same-sex couples because religious organizations that oppose same-sex marriage as irreconcilable with their beliefs will not be required to perform same-sex marriages or otherwise to condone same-sex marriage or relations." Many would say it's a fairly obvious result, but it was articulated by the Connecticut Supreme Court. So that sort of summarizes the response to the risk of losing the ability to refrain from performing same-sex marriages by ecclesiastical leaders such as bishops and temple sealers. Third, I'm going to rebut the argument about same-sex marriage legalization threatening religious liberty. Just last month, in February 2011, Elder Oaks, at a law school speech in California, said the following: "I see a serious threat to the freedom of religion in the current assertion of a civil right of homosexuals to be free from religious preaching against their relationships. Religious leaders of various denominations affirm and preach that sexual relations should only occur between a man and a woman joined together in marriage. One would think that the preaching of such a doctrinal belief would be protected by the constitutional guarantee of the free exercise of religion, to say nothing of the guarantee of free speech. However, we are beginning to see worldwide indications that this may not be so," end quote. And he continued to cite some examples of some of the risks that he was concerned about. And although some of those took place around the globe, one or two of them took place in the United States. So I'll kind of localize my rebuttal to sort of the jurisprudence here in the United States and what religious freedom looks like here. I think it's well established that the government is interested in not putting religious freedom or religious practice A, so let's say the baptism of the Catholic Church over the baptism of the Mormon Church, or in fact any belief or practice of a particular church being preferred above another. So let's take an example here. Let's say that there's an organization called Christ Church Charities, and informed by their religious conscience, they place adoptees only in married households, but they believe that they should go to both same-sex and opposite-sex families. So their religious conscience says, we're only going to place children in households where the parenting couple is married, but we believe it should go without respect to opposite versus same-sex couples. So if the state prohibits or fails to recognize same-sex couples as being married, then this amounts to a burden on the religious practice of Christ Church Charities, because that means they will no longer place children in homes with same-sex couples because of their belief that the couple has to be married. Okay, so the reason that this rebuts this argument about religious liberty is it's a one-way religious liberty. It's just, if your religious liberty happens to be that you believe that same-sex marriage is not appropriate, then you're asserting a violation of religious liberty. The knife cuts both ways here. There are plenty of religions that believe that same-sex marriage is ordained of God, and that's a religious belief and a practice by some organizations. To the extent that same-sex marriage is prohibited, that's a burden on the religious practice and belief of those institutions. To the extent that it's legalized, it's a burden on the religious practice and belief of other religions. So unless one can establish that one religion should be preferred above another, the religious liberty argument doesn't advance the ball. The Connecticut Supreme Court on this issue, it says, many people hold deep-seated religious, moral, and ethical convictions that marriage should be limited to the union of one man and one woman, and that homosexual conduct is immoral. Many hold equally strong religious, moral, and ethical convictions that same-sex couples are entitled to be married, and that homosexual persons should be treated no differently than their heterosexual neighbors. Okay, and I could give more examples, but the point is here illustrated and highlighted by the Connecticut Supreme Court. Unless we're willing to favor one religion over another, religious liberty is not overly burdened by legalizing same-sex marriage any more than it is by its prohibition. One last piece on Catholic Charities, since that's often brought up. Catholic Charities was accepting public funds, from what I understand, and therefore was bound to obey the laws of the state, because people, of course, have a say in how public funds are used. LDS Family Services, on the other hand, is privately funded, and it still adopts babies only out to straight married LDS couples. And even though they engage in sexual orientation and religious discrimination, that's allowed because they don't accept money from the state. And so that's an important point to keep in mind. To close, there's a quote from Clay Essig. He says, we believe that religion is instituted of God and that men are amenable to Him and to Him only for the exercise of it, unless their religious opinions prompt them to infringe on the rights and liberties of others. That's a quote from Doctrine and Covenants 134, verse 4. And arguably, and I think there's a strong case here, that strongly held religious opinions regarding marriage and family are fueling the pro-family campaigns that severely infringe upon the marital and family rights of gay and lesbian neighbors quite often. And so it could be that under that construction of Doctrine and Covenants 134, that infringing upon the rights and liberties of others may not be a protected religious exercise in the, at least from Joseph Smith's view, as expressed in Doctrine and Covenants, of what religious freedom is and what the bounds of religious freedom are. To end, I'll conclude here. There's a long-standing tradition in America to permit religious practice within certain bounds, and within those bounds of religious practice, which is not limitless. If a religion has a belief of sacrificing children, it's not a religious belief that's going to be protected. Okay, so we've got bounds in religious practice, and we apply those same bounds without respect to all religions. To quote again from Doctrine and Covenants 134, we believe that religion is instituted of God and that men are amenable to Him and to Him only for the exercise of it. We do not believe it just to mingle religious influence with civil government, whereby one religious society is fostered and another proscribed in its spiritual privileges and the individual rights of its members as citizens denied. So to conclude, the religious liberty argument doesn't advance an anti-same-sex marriage claim because it necessarily cuts both ways.